Welcome to part 7 of the Eisenhower era. Now we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement had been going on ever since the end of slavery in 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Right? But in the 1950s, we are going to see a lot of movement on the civil rights front. Right? Those of you that know me know I use this boiling pot of water on a stove analogy. The water's not quite boiling yet, but it's starting to bubble pretty good right here in the 1950s. Okay. Now, this is going to begin with a 1951 challenge by the NAACP to the Plessy versus Ferguson law. Right? Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case which allowed for segregation. Right? You could have segregated facilities as long as they were separate but equal. But the NAACP is going to challenge this with a class action suit that they're going to have their special prosecutor argue for them, a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Okay, this court case is going to be 4 different individual court cases that are going to be combined together into the class action suit. The first case in this class action suit was one filed by Oliver Brown, right, which centered around his daughter, Linda Brown, who had to ride a bus 21 blocks to get to her school each day when there was a perfectly good school within walking distance of her house, only 3 blocks away. But it was a whites-only school. Right? So out of this, we get the name of the case, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka et al. Right? That's a combination of these four cases. Okay. On May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court is going to rule on this case. The Chief Justice Earl Warren in the court will rule unanimously that segregation in public schools denied African American children of the equal protection of the laws granted by the 14th Amendment. Right? They stated that the mere act of creating a separation by its very nature creates an inequality, basically saying separate but equal cannot exist, because you introduce a sense of inferiority to those who are being separated out. Right? So this is going to begin the slow and often painful process of desegregation in the United States school systems and ultimately the United States at large, right? A follow-up decision will be issued on the 31st of May, 1955, often referred to as Brown versus Board of Education 2. You now have a 5th case rolled into this, Bowling versus Sharp. Right? And it's going to call for the desegregation of schools, but it's going to say that the schools, public schools, need to be desegregated, quote, with all deliberate speed. And that is going to be kind of a sticking point, what's going to make this a little bit slow and painful. None of these cases say that all schools need to be desegregated immediately. All deliberate speed. What does that mean? Some people would say, well, it means immediately because you have an inequality. But some Southerners would define it differently. One Southern legislature actually said, yes, we will desegregate with all deliberate speed. 200 years, that should be about right. Also in the 1950s, we have the Montgomery bus boycott. And this story all begins with a woman named Rosa Parks. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old tailor's assistant and a member of the NAACP, is going to board a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and have a run-in with its driver named James F. Blake. Now, this is not the first time she's had an encounter with bus driver James F. Blake. In 1943, she had boarded a bus, and she had paid in the front, which was customary. But as required by the segregation of the buses, if you were an African American, if you entered the front of the bus to pay, you would then get off the bus and go in the colored entrance, which was the door at the back of the bus, right? On that day in 1943, she had boarded the bus after a hard day's work and began just wearily walking back to the colored or non-white section of the bus. Blake yelled at her to get off the bus and board the proper entrance, and when she got off the bus to do that, he closed the door and drove off without her. So now we have this new incident in December of 1955. Okay, the first 4 rows of these buses were all designated whites only, right? The rows beyond that were for colored or non-white, right? I'm using the terminology of the day. But there was a bar that separated the whites only section from the non-white section. And if the white section filled up, the bus driver could, at his discretion, move that bar back and make more rows whites only, like, say, for example, the 5th row, 6th row, etc. And those who were not white sitting in those sections would have to get up and go to the back of the bus, right? That's where that phrase comes from, okay? Now, in this case, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks had sat in the 5th row, but the white section had filled up. James Blake had moved the bar back 1 row and had told the 4 individuals sitting there that they needed to get up and move to the back. Rosa Parks decided she was having none of this, right? She refused to get up. He looks at her, Blake looks at her and says, "Are you going to stand up?" Rosa Parks looks at him and goes, "Nah." Blake responded, says, "Well, I'm going to have you arrested." Rosa Parks looked at him and said, "You may do that." And he did. Rosa Parks was arrested. Okay. What will follow is a citywide boycott of the busing system. Now remember, these cities have now become largely African American, so you actually have some economic power here, right? Beginning on December 5th, African Americans and supporters in Montgomery would boycott Montgomery buses and begin walking to work instead, right? The boycott would last for 381 days. During that time, organizers like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy would both have their homes bombed during this boycott, as well as 4 churches in the area. But finally, on November 23rd, 1956, the Supreme Court is going to issue an order saying that the segregation of the busing system there in Montgomery was unconstitutional and that Montgomery had to immediately integrate their bus system. And so the end of segregation of Montgomery buses would happen there in 1956 as a result of Rosa Parks and this bus boycott. In September of 1957, 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education, 9 African American students attempted to enroll at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, right? The governor of Arkansas, Governor Orville Faubus, is going to claim that he's not going to allow this to happen. 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education, not a single school in Arkansas is desegregated, and Orville Faubus is not going to allow that to start now. His response is on September 2nd, 1957, he is going to order the Arkansas National Guard, which remember he's the governor, so he's the commander-in-chief of the National Guard, to surround Central High School to keep the 9 students out, right? He will replace them on September 20th when the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, is going to federalize those troops through executive order, now they're under his command, and order them back to their barracks, right? Eisenhower is not pleased with what he's seeing going on here, right? Of course, Faubus's response is just to call up the Little Rock Police Department and have them surround the school instead. On September 23rd, when school starts, an angry mob of over 1,000 whites will descend upon Central High School and protest while these 9 African American students are escorted into the building. They're allowed to get to their classrooms, but they're also very quickly picked up by Little Rock police and removed, saying, "We're doing this for your own safety." Eisenhower, by this point, has seen enough. He declares that night that what he saw in Little Rock there on the 23rd of September was disgraceful, and he issues an executive order ordering the 101st Airborne to go to Little Rock to escort these 9 students to and from classes. And for the rest of the year, the Little Rock 9, as they become known, will be escorted and protected by the 101st Airborne just so that they can go to school. Think about that for a minute. Imagine what it would feel like if it required the 101st Airborne, if it required special forces to make sure that you could get to and from a classroom safely, because that's exactly what these guys had to do. Faubus wasn't quite done yet. At the end of the school year, he actually shut the school down entirely, still trying to resist this integration of the public school systems.